I've carried this around for years, and I've never told it in one place before. I'm not looking for sympathy, and I'm definitely not expecting anyone to think what I did was clever. If anything, I hope this reads more like a warning than a victory lap. People always imagine art theft as something out of a movie: laser grids, tuxedos, impossible escapes. The truth is usually a lot duller, a lot messier, and a lot more personal. The painting everyone remembers was called the vanished painting by the newspapers after it disappeared. They loved dramatic headlines. It was a masterpiece that seemed to dissolve without a trace, leaving investigators, collectors, and journalists chasing theories for years. Some thought it had been smuggled overseas. Others believed it had been destroyed by accident. A few insisted it had never left the building at all. They were all wrong. My name is William, and I know exactly what happened because I was the one who made it disappear. Not because I hated art. Quite the opposite. I loved it enough to spend years around it, studying restoration techniques, museum procedures, and the strange psychology of collectors who valued a canvas more than the people protecting it. Money played a part, sure. Pride did too. But if I'm honest, the biggest motive was proving something to myself. That I could outthink people who believed their systems were flawless. That belief would cost me far more than I realized. People assume crimes begin with desperation. Mine began with curiosity. I wasn't pacing around looking for a masterpiece to steal. At first, I was just another regular visitor who kept coming back to the same gallery. I learned the routines without anyone realizing I was paying attention. Guards rotated shifts at predictable times. Cleaning crews worked from checklists. Delivery staff came through the same entrance every week. None of it looked like a weakness on its own, but together it painted a picture of how ordinary habits could create blind spots. The painting itself wasn't the only valuable thing in the room, which made it even more interesting. Everyone expected someone to obsess over the most expensive piece. I became fascinated with the people instead. Their confidence, their assumptions, the little shortcuts that inevitably appear when a place has operated smoothly for years. I filled notebooks with observations that, individually, meant nothing. Times. Layouts. Conversations I overheard. I told myself it was just an intellectual exercise, a puzzle to solve without ever acting on it. The dangerous moment wasn't when I started planning. It was when I caught myself thinking, if someone actually tried this, it might work. That single thought changed the way I looked at everything afterward. The line between imagination and intention became thinner than I wanted to admit. Once I admitted to myself that the idea wasn't going away, the planning became far more deliberate. I stopped thinking like a visitor and started thinking like someone trying to predict every possible obstacle. That shift is still the part that unsettles me most, because it happened so gradually. There wasn't a dramatic moment where I decided, I'm going to do this. It was a series of tiny decisions that, stacked together, pointed in one direction. I rented books on museum conservation, not because I intended to damage anything, but because I wanted to understand how paintings were handled, packed, and examined. I studied floor plans that were publicly available and sketched the galleries from memory after each visit. I even changed my routine so the staff would recognize me as just another familiar face. Becoming forgettable turned out to be surprisingly easy. Looking back, I can see how much of it was fueled by ego. Every successful observation convinced me I was smarter than the system. I mistook patience for wisdom and preparation for control. I had no idea that real life has a way of punishing overconfidence. No matter how carefully you think you've planned, the morning I'd chosen felt almost disappointingly ordinary. No storm. No dramatic music. Just commuters hurrying to work and tourists lining up outside the gallery with cameras around their necks. That normality made my heart pound even harder. I remember thinking that if anyone looked closely at me, they'd immediately know something was wrong. Of course, nobody did. People are usually wrapped up in their own lives. I walked through the entrance the same way I had dozens of times before. I nodded politely at the receptionist, spent a while wandering through unrelated exhibits, and forced myself to keep an even pace. The hardest part wasn't pretending to be calm, it was resisting the urge to constantly check the time. Every minute felt like it lasted 10. Then something happened that none of my notes had prepared me for. A school group arrived unexpectedly, filling the gallery with excited voices and teachers trying to keep everyone together. The room became crowded almost instantly, and the quiet rhythm I'd spent months studying disappeared. For the first time since this whole idea had taken hold, I seriously considered walking away. Walking away would have been the smartest decision I could have made. Instead, I convinced myself that the crowd actually worked in my favor. That's the kind of lie you tell yourself when you've invested too much time in a bad idea. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore, I was thinking like someone desperate not to waste months of preparation. The school group drifted from room to room, guided by a museum educator whose voice echoed through the gallery. Guards were occupied answering questions and directing visitors, and the atmosphere became far less predictable than anything I'd rehearsed in my head. I adjusted my timing and waited, pretending to study another painting while watching the room from the corner of my eye. Every unexpected movement forced me to rethink what came next. My palms were damp, my breathing felt too loud, and I kept imagining someone calling my name even though no one there knew me. That's the thing about crossing a line you've only imagined before. Reality doesn't feel exciting, it feels painfully uncertain. I realized then that no amount of planning could eliminate chance. From that moment on, I wasn't following a script anymore. I was improvising, and that terrified me more than I expected. The opportunity appeared for only a few seconds. One of the guides led the students into the next gallery, drawing most of the visitors with them. The room suddenly felt larger, quieter. A security guard stepped away after being called to help with a minor issue near the entrance. Nothing dramatic, just one of those ordinary interruptions that happen in busy places. I stood perfectly still, telling myself I still had time to leave. Instead, I took a slow breath and moved. What happened next is something I'll never describe in detail, partly because the specifics aren't important anymore. The truth is that reality never matched the elegant version I'd imagined during months of planning. My hands weren't steady. My thoughts weren't sharp. Every tiny sound seemed impossibly loud, and every passing second stretched into what felt like minutes. I remember hearing footsteps in the hallway and freezing. I was certain someone had noticed me. They hadn't, they simply walked past without looking in my direction. That was the strangest part of the entire experience. The world kept moving as though nothing extraordinary was happening, while inside my head everything had become deafeningly chaotic. The adrenaline I'd expected to feel like confidence instead felt like panic wearing a convincing disguise. When I finally stepped back into the public areas of the building, I forced myself to move at the same pace as everyone else. Not too fast. Not too slow. I remember focusing on ridiculous details, the pattern of the floor tiles, the hum of the air conditioning, a child complaining about being hungry, because they gave my mind something to hold on to besides panic. No alarms sounded. No one shouted. At first, that felt like relief. Then it became something worse. The silence convinced me that maybe I'd actually pulled it off, and that realization was far more frightening than I'd imagined. There was no dramatic escape, no cinematic chase. Just a growing awareness that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Hours later, the news began to spread. Staff had discovered that the masterpiece was missing, and confusion quickly turned into disbelief. Reports contradicted one another. Some thought the inventory records were wrong. Others suspected an internal mistake before anyone dared say the word theft. Watching those early reports, I felt a strange mix of triumph and dread. The painting had vanished. And for the first time, I understood that disappearing an object was much easier than escaping what I'd done. I barely slept that first night. Every sound outside my apartment made me think someone had finally connected the dots. A car door slammed, and I imagined investigators. A knock from a neighbor sent my pulse racing before I realized they were asking someone else for a package. My imagination became my own worst enemy. The strange part was that the world carried on as if nothing had happened. People went to work. Cafes filled up. The headlines grew louder, but everyday life stayed exactly the same. That disconnect was unsettling. I had expected some dramatic shift, as though committing a crime would instantly change the atmosphere around me. Instead, the only thing that had changed was me. The media couldn't stop talking about the missing painting. Experts argued over impossible theories. Comment sections exploded with speculation. Some blamed professional criminals, others whispered about insurance fraud or an inside job. Everyone seemed convinced they understood what had happened. Reading those stories became a terrible habit. Every new theory gave me a brief sense of relief before replacing it with fresh anxiety. The more attention the case received, the smaller my own world became. I smiled at friends, went through my daily routine, and pretended everything was normal. Inside, I was waiting for the moment my ordinary life finally caught up with my extraordinary mistake. About 2 weeks after the disappearance, I learned something that made my stomach drop. Investigators weren't just examining the gallery anymore, they were speaking with people who had visited in the weeks leading up to the incident. Regular visitors, employees, contractors, volunteers. Anyone who might have noticed something unusual was being asked questions. Eventually, my turn came. The interview itself was polite. An investigator thanked me for my time, asked how often I visited the museum, whether I'd seen anything out of the ordinary, and if I remembered anyone behaving strangely. His questions were calm, almost conversational, which somehow made them more intimidating. I answered carefully, trying to sound helpful without sounding rehearsed. The hardest part wasn't speaking. It was maintaining eye contact. Every pause felt suspicious. Every follow-up question convinced me they already knew the truth and were simply waiting for me to contradict myself. By the time I left, I was mentally replaying every sentence I'd spoken, searching for mistakes that probably didn't exist. For days afterward, I expected another phone call. It never came. That silence should have reassured me. Instead, it became another thing to worry about. I couldn't decide whether I'd escaped suspicion, or whether the investigation was quietly moving in a direction I couldn't see. Months passed, but the case refused to disappear from my life. The headlines became less frequent, yet every anniversary of the theft brought another wave of articles and television specials asking the same question: where did the masterpiece go? Friends would casually mention the mystery over dinner, fascinated by how something so valuable could vanish. I'd nod along, pretending to be just another person intrigued by the story. Keeping up the act was exhausting. The strange thing about carrying a secret is that it slowly changes your personality. I became quieter. I avoided conversations about museums or famous art. I stopped visiting galleries altogether because even walking through one made me uneasy. Places that had once filled me with admiration now reminded me of a decision I couldn't undo. There were moments when I considered confessing simply to end the constant tension. Then fear would take over. I imagined the consequences, not just legal ones, but what my family would think, how my friends would see me, how every choice I'd made afterward would suddenly be viewed through the lens of that single crime. The painting had disappeared in a day. Living with its absence was becoming a life sentence of a different kind. The years gave me distance, but they never gave me peace. People say time heals everything. I don't think that's true. Time dulls memories, but it sharpens perspective. Looking back, I no longer saw myself as the clever person who had outsmarted a system. I saw someone who had let arrogance make decisions that affected countless other people. The painting wasn't just an expensive object. It represented years of work by an artist, the efforts of curators who preserved it, and the chance for ordinary visitors to stand in front of something extraordinary. Whether or not anyone ever recovered it, that absence became part of its history, and so did I. I started avoiding old friends from that period because I worried they'd notice how much I'd changed. Some probably assumed I was simply getting older or becoming more reserved. They had no idea that every major decision I made afterward was filtered through one question: would this bring unwanted attention? Living cautiously became second nature. I built an ordinary life on the surface, but underneath it all was a secret that never stopped shaping my choices. That was the real consequence, not fear of being caught, but realizing I'd become someone who was always looking over his shoulder, even when no one was there. So why say anything now? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. For years, I convinced myself that silence was the safest choice. If nobody knew, then I could keep pretending the worst thing I'd ever done belonged to another version of me. But secrets have a strange way of demanding space in your life. They show up in quiet moments, in conversations that seem unrelated, in the hesitation before answering simple questions about your past. Eventually, I realized I wasn't protecting myself anymore. I was protecting the lie. I'm not writing this to impress anyone. If anything, it's embarrassing to admit how much of my younger self was driven by pride. I confused intelligence with wisdom and risk with purpose. I believed that getting away with something would prove my worth. It didn't. All it proved was that a single decision can echo through decades in ways you never anticipate. Even if the world eventually stops talking about what happened, you don't get the same luxury. You carry the memory into every new chapter of your life. That's the part no one tells you. The hardest prison isn't always made of walls. Sometimes it's made of your own thoughts. If you're wondering whether I was ever caught, the honest answer is no. At least, not in the way people usually mean. No one knocked on my door with handcuffs. No dramatic confession was pulled out of me in an interrogation room. The investigation eventually faded from the headlines, and life, at least on the surface, moved on. To everyone else, the disappearance became an unsolved mystery. To me, it remained a date I could never forget. But getting away with something isn't the same as escaping it. I lost the ability to trust my own reflection. Every success I had afterward felt slightly undeserved, as though it had been built on a foundation no one else could see. Whenever someone called me honest or dependable, I felt a quiet sting because they were praising a version of me that existed only on the outside. That's the hidden price of living with a secret. It slowly separates you from the people who care about you, not because they reject you, but because you stop believing they truly know you. In the end, the painting wasn't the only thing that disappeared. The person I thought I was vanished with it. I've replayed that period of my life more times than I can measure. Every now and then I imagine sitting across from the younger version of myself, the one convinced that careful planning could erase consequences. I know exactly what he'd say. He'd insist he had considered every angle. He'd tell me the reward justified the risk. He'd mistake confidence for certainty, just as I once did. I'd let him finish. Then I'd tell him that the biggest mistake wasn't believing he could outsmart other people. It was believing he could outsmart himself. You can hide actions from investigators. You can avoid suspicion. You can even convince the world that nothing connects you to what happened. What you can't escape is the quiet moment at the end of the day when you're alone with your own thoughts. That's where every shortcut, every lie, and every selfish decision eventually catches up with you. If I'd walked away that morning, my life would have been far less interesting. It also would have been far better. Some opportunities aren't opportunities at all. They're tests, and the smartest decision is recognizing them before it's too late. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading. I know some people will assume I'm trying to justify what I did. I'm not. There isn't a version of this story where I come out looking like a hero. At best, I'm someone who made a terrible decision, lived with it for years, and eventually realized that escaping consequences isn't the same as finding peace. The biggest lesson I learned is that crimes don't end when the act itself is over. They keep unfolding long afterward, changing the way you think, the way you trust people, and the way you see yourself. Even when nobody else knows the truth, you do. That knowledge follows you into every relationship, every achievement, and every quiet moment. So if you're standing at a crossroads, convincing yourself that one dishonest choice will solve your problems, don't believe that voice. It only tells you about the immediate reward. It never mentions the years of fear, isolation, and regret that come afterward. I can't change what I did. All I can do now is admit that the masterpiece wasn't the only thing that vanished. The best version of myself disappeared the day I chose to cross that line, and that's a loss no amount of planning could ever recover.